He called me useless after 10 years of marriage, right as he demanded half of my $1.8 million inheritance. While he toasted with my best friend, expecting tears, I was building a guillotine when I walked into that boardroom in my red dress, surrounded by evidence my mother had foreseen. He realized the useless one was never me. My name is Madison Cole, and until 7 o'clock this evening, I believed my life was a perfectly balanced equation. I am 34 years old, a senior data analyst at Novastride Analytics here in Silver Ridge, Colorado. I understand patterns. I understand cause and effect. I live my life by a discipline that keeps chaos at bay. Or so I thought as I adjusted the strap of the black silk dress Dylan used to say made me look like a movie star. The house smelled of rosemary and red wine reduction, the perfect setting for our 10th anniversary dinner, which we were celebrating 2 days early because Dylan claimed he had an urgent business trip to Chicago. I lit the third candle on the table, confident that I had done everything right. I was the perfect wife waiting for the perfect husband. The front door opened, but the warm greeting I expected never came. Dylan walked into the dining room wearing a face I did not recognize. He did not take off his wet trench coat. He did not come over to kiss my cheek. He did not even look at the rosemary roast beef that had taken me 4 hours to prepare. Instead, he walked straight to the mahogany dining table and dropped a thick, heavy folder right next to the anniversary cake. The thud it made against the wood sounded like a gunshot. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I reached for the manila envelope. Dylan pulled out a chair and sat down, not to eat, but to watch me with a cold, detached exhaustion. "It is over, Madison. I have filed the papers. I have endured this suffocation long enough." I stared at him, my hand freezing halfway to the folder. "Suffocation. Dylan, we are celebrating 10 years. Just this morning, you left a note on the mirror saying you loved me." He let out a sharp, cruel laugh that scraped against my nerves. "I am done pretending. You are too controlling. You are too boring. You have no passion, no spark. You are just a machine that wakes up, goes to work, and comes home to stare at spreadsheets." He leaned forward, his eyes devoid of the warmth I had known for a decade. "To be honest, you are useless to me, Maddie. Outside of keeping this house like a museum, you are absolutely useless." The word useless hit me with the force of a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the table. "You asked me to book a beach trip for next month. You said—" "Men say things. Madison," he cut me off, waving his hand dismissively. "It is what we do to keep the peace until we can make our move. And now I am making mine." He tapped a finger on the divorce papers. "I have thought about you. Though, I want this to be quick. We split everything down the middle, 50-50, including the inheritance." My blood ran cold. My mother, Margaret, had passed away 6 months ago, leaving me a trust fund of nearly $1.8 million. That is my mother's money. "Dylan, it is in a separate trust. It is a marital property since we used some of the interest for house repairs," he said, reciting a line he had clearly rehearsed. "Do not be greedy. I just want my fair share so I can start over. Just sign the papers, transfer the funds, and we can be done." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed violently against the tablecloth. The screen lit up with a message from Sierra Lane, my best friend of 15 years. The preview read, "Dylan just texted me that he told you. I am so worried about you. Sweetie, call me." "Okay." The room seemed to tilt. I looked up at Dylan, holding the phone out. "Why does Sierra know?" "Why did you tell her before you even walked through that door?" Dylan stood up, buttoning his coat. He looked at me with pity, the kind you give a slow child. "Because Sierra has actual sense. She has a brain in her head that isn't made of binary code. She is going to help you. Handle this without making a scene. She promised to keep you calm." He turned his back on me and the dinner I had made. "I am staying at the Grand Hotel tonight. Do not wait up." The door clicked shut. leaving me in a silence that was louder than screaming. I sank to the floor beside the table, the word useless bouncing around my skull like a ricocheting bullet. Useless, boring, controlling. I reached up to pull the tablecloth, sending the china and the cold roast beef crashing to the floor in a chaotic mess of gravy and ceramic shards. I sat amidst the ruin of my marriage, smelling the cold meat and expensive wine. But as I sat there, shivering, a memory of my mother pierced through the fog of my shock. I saw Margaret, her hands stained with grease from her mechanic shop, looking at me with intense seriousness shortly before she died. Her voice whispered in my ear, clear as a bell, "Do not let a man touch your money if his eyes look hollow, Madison. If he looks at you and sees a bank instead of a wife, run." I wiped a tear from my cheek. Dylan's eyes hadn't just been hollow tonight. They had been hungry. I sat there on the cold kitchen floor, surrounded by the wreckage of our anniversary dinner, and allowed the silence to transport me back to where this really began. It was not tonight. It was 30 days ago, in the dim, wood-paneled office of our family attorney, Arthur Klein. That was the day I learned my mother, Margaret Cole, a woman who spent 40 years scrubbing grease from her fingernails after fixing carburetors, had left me a staggering sum. She had left me a trust fund containing $1,800,000. I remembered the moment Arthur read the figure. I had gasped, covering my mouth in shock, tears stinging my eyes at the thought of her lifelong sacrifice. But Dylan, he had not cried. He had not squeezed my hand in comfort. He had stiffened, and for a split second, I saw a flash of predatory hunger cross his face before he masked it with a smile. Before that day, Dylan was a man who resigned himself to his mid-level salary. He complained about money. Sure, but he accepted our modest life. But in the weeks following the reading of the will, he transformed. He became manic. He started bringing home brochures for luxury condos and talking about quitting his job to day trade. Think about it. Maddie. He had argued just last week, pacing around this very kitchen. We transfer the bulk of it to our joint account. I can invest it. I can turn that $1 million into $5 million in 3 years. Why let it sit in some stagnant trust fund controlled by that dinosaur Klein? When I told him that Arthur advised keeping the funds separate to avoid tax complications, Dylan had slammed his hand on the counter. It is always Arthur this. Arthur that, do not trust your own husband. It is insulting. Madison, we are supposed to be partners. I felt a wave of nausea as I connected the dots. I had confided all of my doubts about Dylan's pressure to Sierra. And Sierra, my loud, glittering, twice-divorced best friend, had laughed it off. Oh, honey, let him have his fun, she had said over margaritas 3 days ago. He just wants to be the man of the house. Besides, if you cannot land a rich man, you land a man who is about to be rich. Right. I shuddered. That was her favorite joke. I had heard her say it a dozen times over the years, usually followed by a raucous laugh. Now, the words echoed in my head with a sinister weight. I suddenly remembered my mother's voice, raspy from years of inhaling workshop fumes, warning me about Sierra. That girl has no light of her own, Mom had whispered to me once after Sierra left our porch. She is a void, Madison. She lives by sucking the energy out of other people. You be careful with her. Do not let her near your heart, and certainly never let her near your wallet. I had dismissed it as my mother being harsh, but now, another memory clawed its way to the surface. It was the day of Mom's funeral. I had stepped away to take a breath of fresh air and saw them in the distance, standing under the old oak tree at the edge of the cemetery. Sierra had her hand on Dylan's chest, rubbing it in slow circles. Her face was close to his, whispering something intense. At the time, I thought she was comforting him when they saw me. Sierra had pulled away instantly, rushing over to hug me, her perfume overpowering the scent of the grave dirt. "I am here for you, sweetie." She had cooed. "We are all going to get through this." How could I have been so blind? Sierra had been chipping away at my confidence for years, disguised as a friend. She was the one who called my engagement ring small but cute. She was the one who constantly told me how lucky I was that Dylan stayed with me despite my obsessive nature. I realized with a jolt that every single fight I had with Dylan about money in the last month happened exactly one day after I vented to Sierra. I would tell her I was worried about his spending, and the next day he would come home angry, accusing me of being stingy. I would tell her I wanted to keep the trust strictly in my name, and the next day he would accuse me of not trusting him. Sierra was not just a friend. She was the conduit. She was the strategist feeding him lines. I looked at the empty chair where Dylan had sat minutes ago. I had let my mother die, feeling that I did not trust her warnings. I had let her pass away, thinking her daughter was too weak to see the wolves at the door. "I am sorry." "Mom," I whispered to the empty room, but sorrow was quickly being replaced by a cold, hard resolve. If my mother saw this coming, if she knew Dylan and Sierra better than I did, then maybe she had left me more than just money. Maybe she left me a weapon. I stood up, my knees cracking on the hard floor. I was going to wipe my face. I was going to find the copy of the will, and I was going to find out exactly what else Margaret Cole had prepared for her useless daughter. I did not call Sierra back. Instead, I grabbed my keys off the counter, my movements jerky and mechanical. The text message on my phone screen felt like a lure, a trap set to see if the stupid little mouse would bite. I needed to see her face. I needed to feel the comfort of my best friend, or at least that was the lie I told myself as I reversed out of the driveway. But deep in my gut, a dark, twisting knot told me that I was not driving toward comfort. I was driving toward a crime scene. I sped through the quiet suburbs of Silver Ridge, watching the streetlights blur into streaks of orange fire. Sierra lived in the Arts District, in a converted warehouse loft that she loved because it made her feel superior to suburbanites like me. It was a 20-minute drive, but I made it in 12. When I pulled up to the curb across from her building, the air left my lungs in a sharp hiss. Dylan had told me he was checking into the Grand Hotel near his office. But there, parked brazenly under the yellow glow of a street lamp right in front of Sierra's building, was his charcoal SUV. The license plate mocked me. He was not grieving the end of our marriage in a lonely hotel room. He was here. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, frantic and painful. A rational person would have turned around. A rational person would have gone home to cry. But I was no longer just a rational person. I was a data analyst looking at a discrepancy in the data set, and I needed to verify the source. I got out of the car, leaving the door unlocked. I slipped around to the back of the building, navigating the alleyway that smelled of damp cardboard and trash. I knew the code to the rear gate because Sierra had given it to me years ago for emergencies. I punched it in and climbed the metal stairs to the communal balcony that ran along the second floor. Sierra never closed her blinds. She liked the idea of the city watching her, an exhibitionist in her own private aquarium. Tonight, that vanity was her undoing. I crouched behind a large potted palm and peered through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The scene inside was so sharp, so clear, that it felt like a hallucination. Dylan was sitting on Sierra's white leather sofa. His tie was loosened, his jacket thrown carelessly over a chair. He held a tumbler of amber liquid, swirling it with a relaxed, lazy wrist. He did not look like a man who had just destroyed his wife's life. He looked liberated. Then Sierra walked into the frame. She was not wearing the sweatpants of a worried friend waiting for a late-night crisis call. She was wearing a silver silk robe that shimmered like mercury, tied loosely at the waist. Her hair was pulled up in a messy, elegant bun. She carried a bottle of champagne and 2 flutes. I watched, freezing in the night air, as she poured the sparkling wine. She handed a glass to Dylan and curled her legs under her on the sofa, leaning into him with a familiarity that made my stomach churn. "To the fresh start," Sierra said, her voice muffled by the glass but audible enough. She raised her glass, her eyes gleaming with greed. "And to the money." Dylan clinked his glass against hers. A smirk played on his lips. The same lips that had kissed me goodbye this morning. To finally being free of that useless little analyst. The word useless slashed through me again, but this time it was not a weapon of sorrow. It was a weapon of war. They laughed, a sound that was ugly and conspiring. Sierra reached for a glossy brochure on the coffee table and opened it across Dylan's lap. Even from here, I recognized the logo. It was for Ridgewater Shores, the most exclusive lakefront community in the state. "We can put the deposit down next week," Dylan said, tracing a finger over a photo of a house. I pushed her hard tonight. She is weak. "Sierra." "She will fold." We split the assets, and I walk away with at least $1 million cash. She does not have the stomach for a fight. "God, I love it when you take charge." Sierra purred, leaning in to kiss him. It was a deep, passionate kiss, a kiss of victory. Bile rose in my throat, acidic and hot. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash the glass and tear them apart. But then, the voice in my head changed. It was no longer my voice. It was my mother's voice, cold and steady as steel. "Do not let them see you bleed. Madison, step back. Look at your enemy clearly. Then choose how to strike." My hand was shaking, but I forced it to be still. I pulled out my phone. I switched the camera to video. I framed the shot perfectly, capturing the two of them on the couch, the champagne bottle, the brochure, and their lips locked together. I recorded for 30 seconds. Then, I crept back down the stairs and recorded a 10-second clip of Dylan's car parked out front, ensuring the license plate and the building number were in the same frame. I had the data. The anomaly was identified. I walked back to my car in silence. I did not cry. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at the dark building one last time. They were up there celebrating a victory they had not yet won. They thought I was a spreadsheet they could delete. "If you want every penny accounted for," I whispered to the darkness, "then I will give you an audit you will never survive." I started the engine. The report had begun, and the final column would be their destruction. When I returned to the house, the silence was no longer heavy. It was expectant. Most women in my position would have poured a glass of wine or 3 to numb the pain, but I brewed a pot of black coffee. Alcohol blurs the details, and I needed to be sharper than I had ever been in my life. I walked to the kitchen junk drawer and retrieved the spare key to Dylan's home office. I had never used it before because I respected his privacy, or perhaps because I was foolish enough to believe that a husband's secrets were only about surprise gifts. Tonight, I was not a wife respecting boundaries. I was an auditor conducting a surprise inspection. The key turned in the lock with a satisfying click. The room smelled of cedar and stale air. I sat at his desk, turned on the lamp, and tried the bottom drawer. It was locked. I did not hesitate. I grabbed the flathead screwdriver Dylan had left on the windowsill weeks ago and jammed it into the gap. With a sharp jerk of my wrist, the wood splintered and the lock gave way. What spilled out was not a collection of sentimental letters or innocent keepsakes. It was a chaotic avalanche of paper, and almost all of it was stamped in red ink. "Final notice," I read aloud, my voice flat in the quiet room. "Past due, collections." I spread the documents across the desk, my hands moving with the practiced speed of a professional analyst. I sorted them by date, then by creditor. I pulled up the calculator app on my phone and started punching in the numbers. The total rose with terrifying speed. $52,000 in credit card debt across 4 secret cards, $85,000 in losses on online sports betting platforms, and then The most alarming document of all, a promissory note to something called Redline Holdings LLC for nearly $90,000, with an annualized interest rate that was surely illegal. A handwritten note in the margin read, "Call Dom if payment is late again. Do not make him come to the house. $227,000. I whispered. Dylan was not just leaving me. He was drowning. I turned to his laptop. He had logged out, but I knew his password was the name of his first dog followed by his birth year. I was in within seconds. I opened our joint bank account history and cross-referenced it with the pile of papers. I found a recurring monthly transfer of $2,000 going to an entity listed as SL Creative Consulting. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I searched the state business registry for the company. When the results loaded, I felt a cold smile touch my lips. The principal owner of SL Creative Consulting was Sierra Lane. "You have been paying her," I said to the screen. "You have been funneling our money to her for 2 years under the guise of consulting fees." But the final discovery was the one that turned my heartbreak into pure, icy rage. I found a folder on his desktop labeled Tax Docs. Inside was a PDF of a loan application for $30,000 from a peer-to-peer lending site. The applicant's name was Madison Cole. The Social Security number was mine. But the email address listed for contact was a burner account Dylan used for spam, and the signature at the bottom was a clumsy forgery of my own. He had stolen my identity. He had committed felony fraud because he had maxed out his own credit. I sat back in the chair, the pieces of the puzzle locking together with a deafening click. Dylan did not leave me because he was bored. He did not leave me because I was controlling. He left because he had gambled and spent his way into a hole so deep that only a massive injection of cash could save him. He saw my mother's $1.8 million inheritance not as a windfall for our future, but as a lifeline for his own survival. He needed to divorce me to force a settlement before Dom from Redline Holdings came knocking at our door. I did not cry. The tears had evaporated, replaced by the cold clarity of a risk assessment model. I took photos of every document. I scanned the loan application. I took screenshots of the bank transfers to Sierra. I created a new folder on a secure cloud server, encrypted it with a password neither of them would ever guess, and uploaded everything. I then took the physical papers, put them in a waterproof bag, and taped them behind the back panel of the antique armoire in the guest room. I looked around the house I had carefully curated for 10 years. I realized I had been living inside a high-risk model without ever running a stress test. "You are the variable," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt, "and I am going to solve for X. I would not go to work tomorrow. I would go to Arthur Klein's office. I needed to ask him the one question that mattered now. I needed to know if my mother, in her infinite wisdom and suspicion, had planted a landmine in that will, because if she had, I was ready to detonate it. I walked into Arthur Klein's office the next morning with dark circles under my eyes, but my spine was as rigid as a steel beam. I did not look like the grieving daughter or the abandoned wife who had sat in this chair a month ago. I sat down not to beg for advice, but to negotiate a battle plan. Arthur looked at me over the rim of his spectacles. He did not ask how I was. He simply opened a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound document that was significantly thicker than the one I had seen previously. "I have been expecting you." "Madison," Arthur said, his voice dry and devoid of pity. "I assumed you would return once the initial shock wore off." "I want to see the full will." "Arthur," I said, my voice steady, "not the summary. Not the polite version you read when Dylan was tapping his foot and checking his watch." Arthur sighed and opened the document. "I must apologize for that. Your husband was so focused on the transfer protocols that I judged it best not to interrupt his enthusiasm with the fine print until you were alone. Your mother, Margaret, had a very specific vision for your future." He pointed a gnarled finger at a section titled Article 7, the Marital Fidelity Clause. "This is a conditional trust," Arthur explained, sliding the paper toward me. Your mother did not just leave you $1.8 million. She left you a test. Listen to me closely. If your marriage ends due to the proven adultery of your spouse, the entirety of the trust becomes your sole and separate property, immune to any equitable distribution laws. I stared at the words. So, if I prove he cheated, he gets nothing. Correct, Arthur said. But there are traps. Look here. He tapped the next paragraph. If you voluntarily transfer any significant portion of this principal to your husband before a divorce is finalized, or if you divorce without proof of infidelity, the trust immediately locks. It converts into a fixed income annuity. You would not be able to touch the principal for 10 years. You would only get the interest. My breath hitched. If I had listened to Dylan last week and transferred the money to our joint account, I would have lost control of everything for a decade. And finally, Arthur said, a rare, grim smile touching his lips, there is the poison pill. Your mother called it the Bright Paws provision. Bright Paws, I asked. The animal shelter? The very same. Arthur nodded. If the husband, having been proven unfaithful, attempts to sue the estate or challenge the validity of this trust to claim a share, the trust liquidates immediately. Every single cent goes to the Bright Paws sanctuary. You get zero. He gets zero. The dogs get $1.8 million. I sat back, stunned silence filling the room. Then, a laugh bubbled up from my chest, a ragged, tear-soaked sound. My mother, the mechanic who never trusted a man who didn't have dirt under his nails, had predicted this. She had written a script for Dylan's greed 3 years ago. She knew that if he loved me, none of this would matter. But if he was a predator, she had rigged the trap so that his own hunger would snap the cage shut. She knew, I whispered, wiping a tear that escaped. She knew he would try to take it. She hoped she was wrong, Arthur said gently, but she prepared for being right. He leaned forward, his elbows on the mahogany desk. Now, here is the strategy. To trigger Article 7, we need undeniable proof of adultery. And to trigger the poison pill effectively, we need Dylan to believe he is winning. We need him to be arrogant. We need him to demand the money so aggressively that he walks right into the line of fire. Arthur looked me dead in the eye. I need to know if you can do this. Madison, can you go back there and play the role of the devastated, useless wife? Can you cry and beg and make him believe you are ready to sign whatever he wants? We need him to feel so safe that he brings his mistress out into the open. I thought about the loft. I thought about the champagne toast. I thought about the way Dylan had looked at Sierra and called me a machine. I do not just want to keep the money. Arthur, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I want to destroy his options. I want him to reach for the prize and grab a handful of smoke. Then you must be an actress, Arthur warned. If he suspects you know about the debts or the will, he might change tactics. He needs to think you are weak. I stood up and smoothed the front of my blazer. I thought of the red dress hanging in the back of my closet, waiting for the final act. He thinks I am useless, I said. He thinks I am weak. For my mother, and for myself, I will be exactly what he expects. I will play the victim until the moment the trap shuts. Arthur stood and extended his hand. I will hire the private investigator to formalize the evidence. You just keep him talking. We shook hands. It was the first time in my life I felt like I was holding the steering wheel. The game had started, and for the first time, I was the one writing the rules. I sat on the edge of the sofa, took a deep breath, and pinched the skin of my thigh hard enough to make my eyes water. Then, I dialed Dylan's number. I needed to sound broken. I needed to sound like the woman he believed he had discarded. He answered on the third ring, his voice impatient. What is it? Madison, I am in a meeting. I let my voice crack, forcing a wet, pathetic tremble into the words. I just wanted to ask if we could try one more time. Maybe counseling I can change. Dylan, I know I have been difficult. He sighed, a long, exaggerated sound of exhaustion. We have been over this. You are not just difficult. You are suffocating. You are useless to me in terms of emotional support. Madison, you are a robot who controls everything. I swallowed the urge to scream and instead whimpered into the receiver. I know. I am sorry. I just want this to be over. Maybe you are right about the money. If I transfer the funds, will it make the pain stop? The change in his tone was instantaneous. The irritation vanished, replaced by a smooth, predatory warmth. Now you are thinking clearly. Maddie, look, I think $1 million is fair. I sacrificed my career to stay in Silveridge for you. I gave up big opportunities. That money is just back pay for my loyalty. 1 million, I repeated, making sure my voice sounded small and defeated. Okay. I just need a few days to process everything. Take the weekend, he said, almost cheerfully. I knew you would do the right thing. I hung up and immediately opened my text thread with Sierra. I typed, I think I am being selfish with Dylan. Maybe I should just give him what he wants so I can move on. Her reply came within 30 seconds. That is my smart girl. Honest to God, Madison. Smart women buy their freedom. Give him a chunk of change so he feels like a man, and then you go to a spa and start your new life. Do not drag this out. I smiled coldly at the screen. She was so eager to get her hands on the payout. I typed back, I am terrified to face him alone at the lawyer's office next week. Can you come with me? You are the only one who understands me. There was a pause. She was hesitating. Bringing the mistress to the divorce settlement was bold, even for her. But the greed won out. Of course, sweetie. I will be there to hold your hand. Got you. I whispered. Over the next 3 days, I monitored our joint accounts with the precision of a hawk. Dylan was so confident that the money was coming that he had stopped hiding his tracks entirely. He put down a $5,000 deposit on a model home in Ridgewater Shores. He placed a deposit on a vintage Porsche. He even bought a diamond tennis bracelet for $4,000 from a jeweler downtown using the credit card that was technically still in my name. He was spending my mother's ghost money. He was building a castle on a foundation of clouds. I also noticed the transfers to Sierra's consulting firm increased. He sent her $3,000 on Friday, labeled Project Rush Fee. They were draining the last of the actual marital assets to fund their celebration, convinced that the big refill was just days away. On Sunday night, Dylan came to the house. He let himself in with his key, smelling of bourbon and expensive cologne. He found me in the kitchen, where I was pretending to cry over a photo album. He slammed his hand on the counter, making me jump. I need you to sign the preliminary agreement by Tuesday. Madison, no more stalling. I looked up at him, widening my eyes in fear. I reached into my pocket and silently pressed record on my phone. Dylan, please, I am trying. I just feel so overwhelmed. He leaned in close, his face twisted in a sneer. If you do not sign, I am going to make this ugly. I will tell everyone at your firm that you are unstable. I will tell them you are on medication, that you are depressed, that you messed up client tax returns because you cannot focus. I will ruin your reputation in this town. You would not. I sobbed, letting the tears flow freely now. Try me, he hissed. You are weak, Madison. You have always been weak. Just sign the check and disappear. He stormed out, leaving me shaking in the kitchen. But as soon as the door slammed, the shaking stopped. I saved the recording and named the file Exhibit D Extortion and Duress. The next day, I met Sierra for lunch. She ordered a kale salad and lectured me for an hour about self-love. You have to let go of the past, she said, squeezing my hand across the table. Dylan is a good guy, but he has needs you could not meet. It is not your fault. But holding on to the money, that is just spite. Be the bigger person. You are so right, I said, looking at her with wide, trusting eyes. You are so wise. Sierra, I do not know what I would do without you. That is what friends are for. She beamed. I took a sip of my iced tea to hide the smirk threatening to break through. I mentally added a line to my case file: Sierra Lane undue influence and conspiracy to defraud. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. My face was puffy from the crying I had forced myself to do. I looked tired. I looked beaten. I looked exactly like the useless little wife they laughed about. Good. I told my reflection. Let them think you are broken. I washed my face and applied a layer of night cream. The mask was perfect. If they thought I was useless, they would never look at my hands to see the knife I was sharpening. A useless person is not a threat. A useless person is invisible. And invisibility was the greatest weapon I possessed. The meeting with Jack Morrissey took place in a booth at the back of a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. Jack was exactly what you wanted in a private investigator, which meant he was entirely forgettable in appearance, but possessed eyes that missed nothing. He slid a heavy manila envelope across the Formica table. You have enough here to bury him. Ms. Cole, Jack said quietly, taking a sip of black coffee. The photos are explicit. Hotel receipts, dates, times. But the audio, that is the nail in the coffin. He handed me a small digital recorder and headphones. I put them on. The sound was grainy at first, recorded from a directional microphone directed at a park bench, but the voices were unmistakable. She is hanging on longer than I thought, Dylan's voice said, sounding bored. That old mechanic hag has a bad heart, but it beats like a stubborn drum. Once she kicks it, we are set. We just have to wait for the ticking to stop. Do not be mean. Sierra's voice giggled, lacking any genuine rebuke. But seriously, will the daughter be a problem? Madison Dillon laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. She is a doormat. I will roll her up and put her in the corner while we spend the inheritance. I took the headphones off. My hands were gripping the table so hard my knuckles were white, but my face remained an impassive mask. I did not cry. I did not tremble. The sadness had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard ash of determination. There is more, Jack said, pulling out a document. I ran a deeper credit check. That loan from Redline Holdings, the one for $90,000, it requires a guarantor. He signed your name. Madison. I had a handwriting expert look at it preliminarily. It is a clumsy forgery. If he refuses to settle, you do not just have grounds for divorce. You have leverage for a felony fraud charge. I took the paper. It was not just a document. It was the ace of spades. The next day, I sat in Arthur Klein's office, and together we assembled the weapon. We created a black binder, thick and ominous. We labeled the sections with clinical precision. Exhibit A was adultery, containing the photos and transcripts. Exhibit B was dissipation of marital assets, detailing the transfers to Sierra. Exhibit C was fraud and forgery. Exhibit D was the insults to the deceased. This is not a settlement offer, Arthur noted with satisfaction as he snapped the rings shut. This is an indictment. As the legal artillery was being assembled, I decided my physical shell needed to match the steel I felt inside. I went to the most expensive salon in Silver Ridge. I told the stylist to cut off the long, limp hair Dylan liked because he said it made me look traditional. I walked out with a sharp, angled bob, dyed a honey blonde that caught the light. I looked in the mirror and did not see a tired analyst. I saw a woman who looked like she could run a boardroom or ruin a man's life before breakfast. I spent the evenings taking back my territory. I packed Dylan's clothes, his golf clubs, and his participation trophies into cardboard boxes and stacked them in the garage. I stripped the bed we had shared and bought new sheets, high thread count Egyptian cotton in a cool gray. I called the security company and changed the alarm code to the date of my mother's birthday. I installed hidden cameras in the living room and kitchen, not because I expected him to return, but because I was done with blind spots. Finally. I pulled the dress out of the back of the closet. It was a structured crimson sheath dress I had bought 5 years ago. Dylan had sneered at it, telling me I looked like I was trying too hard to be someone I am not. I took it to a tailor and had it fitted until it hugged every curve like armor. I bought a pair of black stiletto heels, sharp enough to puncture. The night before the settlement meeting, I did not sleep. I sat at my dining table, the black binder in front of me. I rehearsed every line. I practiced my silence. I practiced the exact moment I would slide the evidence across the table. I visualized Dylan's arrogance crumbling. I visualized Sierra's smirk fading. I stood up and walked to the full-length mirror in the hallway. I was wearing simple pajamas, but in my mind, I was already wearing the red dress. I looked into my own eyes. "Tomorrow," I whispered to the reflection. "The word useless will be deleted from every story that bears the name Madison Cole." The morning of the settlement meeting, I walked into the lobby of Arthur Klein's building wrapped in a shapeless beige trench coat, looking every bit the weary, defeated woman Dylan expected to see. I excused myself to the ladies' room. Standing before the mirror, I unbuttoned the coat and let it fall to the floor. Underneath, the crimson dress fit like a second skin, sharp and unapologetic. I applied a fresh coat of blood-red lipstick, checked my reflection, and left the coat in the corner. The Madison Cole who walked out was not the one who had walked in. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the conference room. Dylan was already there, leaning back in his chair, laughing at something Sierra had just whispered. He was wearing a brand new navy suit. Sierra sat next to him, dressed entirely in white silk, looking for all the world like a bride anticipating a reception. When they saw me, the laughter died in their throats. Dylan's eyes widened, scanning the dress, the heels, the sharp bob cut. He looked confused, as if he had walked into the wrong room. "Shall we begin?" Arthur Klein said, pulling out a chair for me. I sat down, crossing my legs and placing my black binder on the table. I said nothing. Dylan's lawyer, a sweaty man named Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. "Right. Well, we have drafted a proposal that we believe is very generous. Dylan is not asking for the house. He is willing to walk away with a clean 50-50 split of the liquid assets, specifically the inheritance trust. That comes to roughly $900,000. Dylan leaned forward, putting on his solemn face. "I am trying to be fair. Madison, I know how much that money means to you, but I have to think about my future too." I let my lower lip tremble just slightly. I looked down at my hands. $900,000 is it really that much? Dylan sighed, the sound of a man burdened by a slow child. "Madison, look at the big picture. I have carried this family for 10 years. I stayed in Silver Ridge for you. I sacrificed my career growth to handle your emotional limitations. I put up with the boredom, the control. I earned this." Sierra nodded beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm. "He really has been a saint, Madison. You should be grateful he is being this amicable." I looked at Arthur. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. It was time. The tremble vanished from my lip. I sat up straight, my eyes locking onto Dylan's. "You are right. Dylan, you have been very busy." I flipped the binder open. The snap of the rings echoed in the silent room. "Let us look at Exhibit B," I said, my voice clear and cool as ice water. "Dissipation of marital assets." I slid a series of highlighted bank statements across the table. Here we have 24 months of transfers to SL Creative Consulting, totaling $48,000. Here we have a $5,000 deposit for a home in Ridgewater Shores, paid last week. Here is a $4,000 charge for a diamond bracelet. And here is a deposit for a Porsche 911. Dylan's face turned a shade of gray, but he tried to bluster through it. So what it is joint money? I can spend it how I want. Arthur Klein leaned in, his voice like gravel. Actually, Mr. Reed, in this state, using marital funds to facilitate an extramarital affair or to purchase assets in anticipation of leaving the marriage is classified as waste. It is not your money to spend, it is theft from the marital estate. That is ridiculous, Dylan spat. I am about to come into $1 million. I was just advancing myself the cash. Were you? I asked softly. I reached into the binder again, because that brings us to the Redline Holdings loan. I slid the photocopy of the loan application across the mahogany, the one with the $90,000 figure and the forged signature. You took out a high-interest loan from a predatory lender because you were drowning in gambling debt, I said, narrating his life back to him. And because your credit is ruined, you signed my name as the guarantor. I looked at Sierra. Her hand had dropped from Dylan's arm. Her eyes were darting from the document to Dylan's face. You have debt? Sierra asked, her voice shrill. You told me you had savings. You told me the house deposit was cash. It is cash, Dylan snapped, sweat beading on his forehead. Or it will be, once she signs the check. I am not signing any check. Dylan, I said. I tapped the document with a manicured red nail. This is a felony, identity theft, fraud, forgery. I can hand this to the district attorney this afternoon. Or, I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was suffocating. Or we can keep this here, as a gentle reminder of your position. Sierra pulled her chair away from him, the screech of the legs against the floor sounding like a scream. You used her name, Dylan, if you are broke. Who is paying for the lawyer? Who is paying for the loft? I am good for it, Dylan shouted, slamming his hand on the table. But the bravado was thin. He looked at me, his eyes full of hate and fear. You planned this. You set me up. I did not make you steal. Dylan, I replied, and I did not make you cheat. I closed the binder. I looked at the man who had dominated my life for a decade, the man who had made me feel small so he could feel big. He looked tiny now. You called me useless, I said, my voice devoid of anger, stating a simple fact. You said I was boring because all I did was stare at spreadsheets. You were right, Dylan. I do not have a talent for emotion, but I am excellent at reading a balance sheet, and the numbers today are very bad for you. It does not matter, Dylan shouted, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. He stood up, knocking his chair back against the wall. That trust fund was commingled. We used the interest for the roof repairs. The law says it is marital property, and no binder full of receipts is going to change that I will sue you for every penny. Arthur Klein did not blink. He simply reached into his briefcase and placed a heavy, bound document on the table. It was the original Margaret Cole Trust. I anticipated this reaction, Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Mr. Reed, please read Article 7, the paragraph titled, The Fidelity Clause. Read it aloud, if you please. Dylan snatched the document. He scanned the page, his eyes darting back and forth. His breathing hitched. Read it, I said softly. If the marriage of the primary beneficiary is dissolved due to the proven adultery of the spouse, Dylan read, his voice losing its volume with every word. The entirety of the trust principal and all accrued interest shall be classified as the sole and separate property of Madison Cole, immune to any claim of equitable distribution. He looked up, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. But you have to prove it in court. That takes years. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I placed it in the center of the mahogany table and pressed play. The video from the loft filled the silence. There they were, clear as day on the high-definition screen, Dylan and Sierra kissing on the white sofa, clinking glasses. To the fresh start. Sierra's voice chirped from the speaker. and to the money. Then Dylan's voice, to finally being free of that useless little analyst. Sierra gasped, covering her mouth. That was just a joke we were role-playing. Role-playing, I asked. I swiped the screen to the audio file Jack had recorded in the park. She is hanging on longer than I thought. Dylan's voice sneered through the room. That old mechanic hag has a bad heart once she kicks it. We are set. The room went deathly still. Mr. Henderson, Dylan's lawyer, took off his glasses and began to polish them vigorously with a handkerchief, refusing to look at his client. Sierra went pale, her white dress suddenly making her look ghostly rather than bridal. There is one more section, Arthur Klein said, cutting through the tension. The poison pill. If the adulterous spouse attempts to litigate, contest the will, or claim any portion of these funds despite the evidence, the trust contains an automatic liquidation trigger. Arthur leaned forward. The entire sum of $1,800,000 will be immediately transferred to the Bright Paws Sanctuary. Neither Madison nor Mr. Reed will receive a cent. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled brochure for the animal shelter. I slid it across the table until it rested under Dylan's shaking hands. Mom took me there once, I said, my voice steady. She told me, Madison, when you do not know who to trust with your money, give it to the creatures who cannot betray you. She knew, Dylan, she knew you would try to burn the house down to get the gold, so she rigged it to explode. Dylan stared at the brochure. The realization washed over him in a wave of horror. He was trapped. If he fought, the money vanished to the dogs. If he folded, he got nothing. And waiting in the wings was the felony fraud charge and $200,000 in debt. He turned to Sierra, looking for a lifeline. Sierra, we can fight this, right? We can find a loophole. Sierra looked at the brochure, then at the binder of evidence, and finally at Dylan. The calculation in her eyes was cold and instant. She realized the golden goose was not just dead, it was rotting. Leave me out of this, Sierra whispered, pulling her chair further away. I did not sign that loan application. Dylan, that is on you. Dylan looked as if he had been slapped. He was alone. I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the table. Here are your options. Dylan, option A. You sign the waiver right now. You admit to the adultery. You accept full responsibility for your debts. You walk away with nothing but your freedom. I will not file the fraud charges, and I will not call the shelter. I paused, letting the silence weigh on him. Option B, I continued, my voice hardening. I push this button on my phone. I call the director of Bright Paws and authorize the transfer. Then I call the district attorney and hand over the forgery evidence. You go to prison, and you go to prison broke. Dylan looked around the room. Mr. Henderson was packing his briefcase, clearly done. Sierra was staring at the wall, refusing to meet his eyes. You would really give it all to the dogs, Dylan stammered, his voice breaking. Try me, I said. I would rather see a stray cat eat gourmet salmon for the rest of its life than let you buy one more drink with my mother's money. Dylan's hand shook violently as he reached for the pen. He looked at me one last time, searching for the submissive wife he had known. But she was gone. He signed the document. The scratch of the pen against the paper was the sound of his entire future collapsing. He had gambled everything on me being useless. It was the most expensive bet of his life. The heavy oak doors of the building closed behind me, but the silence of the parking garage was short-lived. I heard the scuff of leather shoes on concrete before I saw him. Dylan stepped out from behind a pillar, blocking the path to my car. He looked nothing like the polished man in the boardroom. His tie was pulled askew, his hair was wild, and his eyes were red-rimmed with a mix of fury and desperation. You think you are clever, he whispered, his voice echoing against the gray walls. You think you can just leave me with nothing? I stopped, clutching my keys, my thumb hovering over the panic button. I left you with your freedom. Dylan, that is more than you deserve. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The smell of stale fear and aggression radiating off him was potent. I want compensation. Madison. I want a severance package. You are going to transfer $100,000 to me by tomorrow morning. If you do not, I will go online. I will tell everyone you are unstable. I will say you are on antipsychotics. I will tell your clients you help people cheat on their taxes. I stared at him, my heart rate spiking, but my hands remained steady. I slipped my phone from my pocket and held it up, the screen already glowing with the recording interface. You are attempting to blackmail me immediately after signing a settlement agreement, I said, my voice calm and loud enough for the security cameras to pick up. That is a fresh crime. Dylan, stop acting like a lawyer, he shouted. He lunged forward, his hand clamping around my wrist, squeezing hard enough to bruise. I am talking to my wife. You owe me. You are soft. Madison, you have always been. He never finished the sentence. My body reacted before my brain did. I twisted my wrist against his thumb, exactly as the self-defense instructor had taught me, breaking his grip with a sharp torque. I stepped back and shoved him hard in the chest. Get away from me, I shouted, my voice booming through the garage. He stumbled back, shocked that the machine had fought back. A security guard, alerted by the shout, came running from the booth, his hand on his radio. Dylan looked at the guard, then back at me, realizing he had lost the physical advantage. If you ever contact me again, I said, looking him dead in the eye, I will send this recording, along with the file on the forged signature, directly to the district attorney. There is no trust fund clause to save you from prison. Dylan, there is only the state penitentiary. He sneered, spitting on the ground near my feet. You are cold-blooded. You know that. You have no one. You are going to die alone in that big house with nothing but your money. I smoothed the front of my red dress, feeling the adrenaline settle into a cold, hard power. I offered him a final, pitying smile. At least the money does not call me useless, I replied. And right now, it is funding a life you will never understand. I got into my car and drove away, leaving him standing in the exhaust fumes of his own failure. 6 months later, the sunlight streamed through the glass walls of a corner office in downtown Silver Ridge. The sign on the frosted glass door read, Cole Strategic Forensics. There was no Reed in the name. I sat across from a woman named Sarah. She was 40, trembling, and wiping her eyes with a tissue. On the desk between us lay a dossier I had compiled evidence that her husband was using their retirement savings to fund a startup that did not exist. I feel so stupid, Sarah whispered, looking down at her hands. He always told me I was bad with money. He said I was useless at understanding finance. I reached across the desk and placed my hand over hers. The gesture was warm, but firm. You are not useless. Sarah, I said softly, you just lacked data. When you have the data, you are unbeatable. I watched her straighten her spine, the same way I had done in Arthur Klein's office. After she left, I opened my checkbook. I wrote a check for $10,000 payable to Bright Paws Sanctuary. It was the first of many. I smiled as I signed my name. I was using my mother's money to protect the innocent, just as she had protected me. That evening, I stood on the porch of my home. The house was different now. The heavy, dark furniture Dylan loved was gone, replaced by modern, airy pieces that let the light in. I held a glass of wine and looked out over the twinkling lights of Silver Ridge. I was alone, but the silence was not empty. It was full of peace. I thought back to that night in the dining room, the way the word useless had shattered me. I realized now that the shattering was necessary. It was the only way to rebuild the structure properly. If he had not called me useless, I thought, taking a sip of the wine, I might never have known how powerful I truly am. And that is the only debt I owe him. He taught me that no one gets to define my value but me. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's chat about what you thought of Madison's revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so more people can hear this story of transformation and justice.